Welcome back. Cory Bernardi has had an interesting political journey, to say the least. The South Australian senator is forthright in his views and certainly ignites debate. He is also a man who has had a variety of jobs prior to entering politics, from labourer to stockbroker. We had the chance to speak with Senator Bernardi recently, and started by asking him what prompted him to enter politics.
I've had a very fortunate career in a wide variety of areas, but there was a time where I actually was hospitalised for about 10 months and with tuberculosis, and so I had a lot of time to think, and I decided that I wanted to make a contribution to community service, and hence I volunteered with the Liberal Party whilst doing my businesses, and just one day they said, would I like to consider running for the Senate, and I did. So it was an amalgam of circumstances and good timing because my kids had just started school.
Generally, when one enters politics, it is because one has a fascination with the political sphere. Were there any major events that triggered such a political fascination in you?
There were. When I was in, I think, year 8 or 9 at school, Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, and he was doing a tour of FM radio stations, and I got to speak with him on air and asked him a normal question about young people getting involved in politics. And then the next day I got a telegram saying, I'm sorry, I couldn't speak with you personally. And I thought, well, hang on, this telegram cost $8, I think it was at the time, and I thought it was telling me something that's wrong. And then the next day I got exactly the same telegram again, and I thought, well, you've got a government that's wasting money telling me something that's not true. There's got to be a better way. And that kind of piqued my political interest.
When you were younger, who did you look up to that helped shape your political career?
Well, I wasn't particularly politically engaged, I would say, during school, but I was always a very strong supporter of business people, in that, there were aspirations of people who had done really, really important things. And I had been given, I guess my early life was in small business, and I recognised that self-sufficiency and reliance were truly important. And when I recognised that I wasn't part of the Labor group, I started looking more professionally at, I guess, the standings and ethos of the Liberal Party, and that's what got me involved there.
Since becoming a nation in 1901, Australia has had many governments, led by some very capable people. Who do you regard as Australia's greatest Prime Minister, and why?
Well, in my lifetime, certainly, I enjoyed the Hawke, Keating, Howard governments, but I think Howard was probably the best of those people because, I'm more akin to him in many of the policy areas as well. But if you go through history, Sir Robert Menzies is a colossus of the Parliament. He, was part of the United Australia Party, part of the formation of the Liberal Party, was Prime Minister on 2 occasions, I think for 19 years. And, that's an extraordinary achievement. And I don't think it's going to be equalled in this country. And so he would have to rank number 1, I think, closely followed by John Howard, number 2.
In 2006, at 37 years of age, you were elected to the Senate to replace Robert Hill. 11 years later, in 2017, you formed your own party, the Australian Conservatives. What was it that motivated you to start this party?
There's no single thing. It was a huge step, and it's one that I didn't take lightly. But in essence, I realised the system was no longer working for the Australian people, and I thought that lies fairly and squarely with both of the major parties who have lost their reason for being except to be in power. And wanting to be in government is not a good enough reason, nor is I want to be a politician so I can be a politician, which is what a lot of people who come up here feel. And I thought they'd lost their desire for the enduring values and principles that were the reasons I joined the Liberal Party, and they needed to be kept to account. I tried to do that internally, didn't do a good enough job, and so when they started to repeat the mistakes that they'd condemned so rightfully in others, I thought there has to be a better way, and so the Australian Conservatives was born, and we're very happy with the progress of it, 10 months in.
Where do you see the Australian Conservatives in relation to the other major political parties in 10 years from now?
I'd like to think that we'll be influencing outcomes in politics. I could see in my mind's eye that we would have a substantial representation in the Senate, maybe holding the balance of power. I'd also like to see that maybe 1 or 2 seats in the House of Representatives could be there. That would be, the dream inside of 10 years. I think it's achievable if everything goes right, but, it's going to be a lot of work and a lot of commitment between now and then.
What do you find frustrating about your job?
Almost everything. Look, it can be very frustrating at times because the machinery of government can move very, very quickly when necessary, or it can be extraordinarily slow. And it's very frustrating to see things that need to be done and having to endure the agony of waiting for others to come to that conclusion. And I say that not in any partisan sense. It's just it seems to be that there's the priorities of government are about the immediate fixes of the political problems rather than the long-term structural fixes that the country needs. And it's not just government; it's the crossbench as well, and many politicians. So they're always looking for advantage for themselves politically rather than the long-term advantage of the country, and that's something I think we need to change.
What is the most rewarding aspect of your job?
It's the ability to help people. It sounds a bit trite, but you really can influence outcomes. And we might be. I remember in my first year in Parliament, a man rang and said he was having trouble dealing with a superannuation fund over what I thought was a very simple matter. And after many years of trying, I managed to get that fixed for him in a couple of phone calls in a couple of days. More recently, I go back and say, to stop the government from entering into an extradition agreement with China, I think is a really significant step for the Parliament. And, that was started under my watch, and I was fortunate to get enough people on board to make that happen. So you can do good things for people, you can do good things for the country. I only now wish we could arrest the spiralling debt problem that future generations will inherit.
What advice would you give to any person who wishes to enter politics?
It's a great question because everyone is different, but I would strongly counsel anyone to go out and get some real life experience, and that means, make mistakes, try businesses or whatever your profession would be, but have an understanding of how the world works practically rather than just in a theoretical sense. You can't learn in textbooks what you can learn from running a business, and it all comes down to people. You're going to have to manage intrapersonal relationships and customer relationships or stakeholder relationships, and if you can understand human nature and you know very clearly what you stand for, then you'll come into politics and you'll be more resilient, you'll be more effective, and you'll enjoy it much more than if you're just coming here to go along for the ride.
Australia has infamously slow internet. What do you believe should be done to improve this situation?
Well, I'm always suspicious of when governments have grand plans to nationalise any infrastructure, and particularly when it comes to digital infrastructure. I think that ultimately you have to unleash the power of the private sector and allow them to build as competitive a fibre highway as you possibly can. I don't know what I don't know about new technology that's going to be coming down the pipe, but I can always assure you that private industry will do better in that space than government ever will. But there are areas where market failure takes place, and that's in a big country like Australia and many rural and regional areas. And I think that's where it's well justified to invest in either wireless or some fixed line technologies, or even some Wi-Fi technology like 5G. Those sorts of things, I think, can overcome some of the market failures. But ultimately, you're going to get better service and you're going to get better outcomes when it comes to having great competition.
Do you think that children born today will be better or worse off than their parents in relation to health, education and housing affordability?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there are going to be different challenges, and I think we have an intergenerational moral obligation to sort some of them out. You know, the reality is that any child born today is going to inherit a shed load of debt that's been accrued by, in the last 10 years of government, and probably in the next 10 years as well. I think that's morally wrong, and they're not going to have much to show for it. I do think there is going to be a strong economic awakening, in the sense that the last 40 years have been fueled by debt binges, and that's simply unsustainable. So you've got to be careful what you wish for, but the reining in of credit markets could see, asset prices fall. It could see some economic difficulties, but ultimately that you will be better served in the long run from dealing with these issues, even though there might be a great deal of short-term pain. So I think probably they'll be better off because of advances in medical technology and maybe quality of life, but there'll be a whole range of different circumstances that we haven't foreseen in my lifetime.
Lastly, over the past 100 years, various Australian governments have introduced many controversial programs and/or policies. Which do you believe was the worst, and how would you have tackled that issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are many very bad policies. I think, quite frankly, in the recent times, the abandonment of the debt ceiling or the debt limit has seen a catastrophic escalation in deficit spending in this country. And I think that is a huge problem. You've also got issues associated with some of the migration programs. I think migration is simply too high in this country. It's no longer acting in our national interest, and that has historically been used as a political investment by mostly the Labor Party, but successive governments have said, well, let's have high migration because it grows the size of the economic pie, but it doesn't act to the interests of every individual Australian. So there's some of the issues I think we're dealing with. The concept of multiculturalism, that somehow another culture is the equivalent or deserves equal treatment as Australian culture or Western culture, I think is a great crime against our way of life, because self-evidently all cultures are not equal, and if people want to come to Australia, it's because of our culture that has evolved within a framework upon a set of rules and expectations that we should never compromise on.
Senator Bernardi, thank you for your time today.